The soft green hills of Minnesota lay placid in the August sun. Oak and birch and pine scarcely stirred in the breeze which brought a hint of coolness to the drowsy atmosphere. Quiet was the forest which stretched its leagues and leagues of feathery tops to the north. Even the birds were silent, for this was August. In the few small fields which the industry of the woodsmen had cleared out of the woods, no farmer moved. Scythe and hoe hung idle on their hooks. It was Sunday. At the Lower Sioux Agency near Fort Ridgely, the morning of August 17, 1862, services were held as usual in the little Episcopal church. The rector addressed his simple words of faith to a mixed congregation. English and German farmers, a few agency employees and traders, and a handful of converted Sioux Indians. But his eyes probably wandered most frequently to a single dark figure which sat morose and alone in the shadows of the back of the church. We have a photograph of him as he must have looked then, that silent communicant. He was a tall and splendid figure in his neat black broadcloth with white collar and dark cravat, dressed as well as the best garbed white man among them. Only his head and feet were in sharp contrast. His feet were covered with doe-skin moccasins, beaded according to the highest art of the Indian race. His head was bare, and the swarthy bronze of his face framed two gleaming black braids of hair, which swept downward over his shoulders to fall across his broad chest in front. If anybody in the church felt like shrinking from his dark presence, they gave no sign, for they all knew him. He was Little Crow, the great chief of the Santee Sioux, the steadfast friend of the white man, their guarantee of peace with the dark people of the forests. The service ended. With the perfect courtesy, he greeted the white men and women assembled. Suavely, he complimented the rector's eloquence, shook hands with everybody, strode out, mounted his horse, and rode off, never to return. Little Crow attended church that Sunday morning. By the evening of the next day, he was elbow deep with the blood of those with whom he had worshipped. Why did Little Crow attend that last service? Nobody will ever know. Many have held that it was for the purpose of cloaking the treachery which must have been planned and ordered. But the reason may have been more human. Perhaps the dark chief came to be once more with the friends with whom he was to part with forever. Little Crow was an unusual Indian. He affected the white man's garb and ways, but was at heart an utter barbarian. His manners were those of a refined gentleman. His diplomatic talent and oratorical ability were very marked, and the events were to prove him a patriot for his people. His friendship with the whites had once been genuine, but it was blasted long ago. An endless list of his people's grievances cried out to him. Rascally traders using government red tape to withhold food from his starving red men, to sell them wormy flour and spoiled bacon at exorbitant prices, the seduction of Indian women by degenerate white men, and the multiplication of half-breed children. A reproach and an indignity to every honorable Sioux. Inkpaduta in the north, counting the spoils of his Spirit Lake raid, inciting to the warpath. These and many other reasons fanned the smoldering flame. Above all his tribe, Little Crow felt the wrong and the dishonor. As son and grandson of chiefs, he had known the days of his people's glory. Then came the shameful Mendota Treaty of 1851, when the Sioux ceded most of their hunting grounds. He played his own part when, after a drunken fight with his brother, he nursed a crippled wrist and swore to banish firewater from his tribe. He sent for a Christian missionary to teach the people the white man's way. Reverend Williamson, the man of God, won a place in Little Crow's heart. But now his goodness was all forgotten in the degeneracy he attributed to all white men. Only a week before the Sioux received the final insult, their chief sent to the agency to plead for long-promised government stores. Andrew Gay Merrick, a trader, listened with a sneer. "If they're hungry, let them eat grass for all I care," was his callous reply. The Sioux heard. The Sioux remembered. 40 miles from the agency, 3 German farmers and the wife and daughter of one of them sat at Sunday dinner. 4 Indians entered the cabin. A crash of rifles and a flurry of knives. The happy dinner party lay dead. The Indians rode into the forest. It was the signal. Up and down the Minnesota River, stealthy bands of warriors set forth. Monday dawned. With the first peep of sun, the little community of traders at the lower agency was awakened by a gunshot, followed by a hideous war whoop. The people ran out of their homes into the streets to be shot down at their doors by Sioux posted in ambush. Merrick, whose cruel Tom had stirred the Indians' hatred, was killed in front of his store. When his body was found days later, the mouth was stuffed with grass. Other traders met ends as bloody. Franco Labat was slain on his counter. Henry Bellin, James W. Lindy, and 5 other traders and clerks died similarly. Every soul in the agency would have perished, but the Sioux began looting the ammunition stores and food boxes, permitting about 50 to reach the river. Their heroic ferryman, Hubert Millier, plied his boat until, as he returned for the last load, he was cruelly shot. Those cut off from the crossing were slain, and the Indians pursued the refugees, slaying 7 more in the terrible 15-mile foot race to Fort Ridgely. The arrival of the haggard vanguard of that fleeting band must have been a terrific shock to the people of the fort. The whole nation would be shocked by the events which followed. The agency massacre was not the only tragedy that morning. While the Sioux were killing the traders, smaller parties swept through the surrounding settlements. The country was bleeding and on fire. The Indians took the farms as they came, slaughtering the men, carrying the women off as captives and butchering the children, or allowing them to follow their mothers according to the whim of the moment. Lake Chetek in Renville County was especially bloody. In the first day alone, more than 200 white persons were killed in the vicinity of the lower agency. Some of the experiences of the refugees are almost unbelievable. Tales of heroism also come down to us from that massacre. Men and women, and even children, sacrificed themselves to save their friends. The story of 11-year-old Merton Eastlick and his devotion to his baby brother Johnny is worth retelling. When the Indians struck Lake Chetek settlement, the Eastlick family hid with other settlers in the rushes of the streambed. The Sioux found them and killed John Eastlick, the father, and 3 of the 5 boys. Mrs. Eastlick was captured, but before they found her, she hid her baby Johnny and charged his only surviving brother Merton never to leave him until he died. Mrs. Eastlick eventually escaped from the Indians and was found by Augustus Garzang, a mail carrier, and was crazed with belief that her whole family was dead. He took her to the town of New Ulm. On the way 40 miles from the scene of the massacre, they found Merton and Johnny. The lad had carried the baby on foot and was hiding from the Indians and subsisting on berries. He was an emaciated skeleton with the flesh worn off his bare feet and was unable to speak for days. But the baby and the boy were safe. The exact number of massacred probably will never be known. Minnesota state records list 644, but there were hundreds of women and children unaccounted for taking capture. After the Battle of Wood Lake, 269 of these were recovered. Scores were rescued at other times, and the record of those never heard of again will never be complete. And what of the soldiers at Fort Ridgely, 15 miles from the lower agency? Captain John S. Marsh of the 5th Minnesota was in command. As the first of the refugees burst into the fort with their frightened story, Marsh acted quickly, sending a courier to Fort Snelling for help. He started promptly for the agency with 46 men and the post interpreter Peter Quinn, leaving only a skeleton guard behind. They went on wagons, but dismounted a mile from their destination. On the way, they met a stream of refugees. Here and there, they passed dead bodies. They began to realize that they were in the midst of a great disaster. an Indian uprising of nightmare proportions. Unused to Indian fighting but supremely confident, young Marsh led his men down to the ferry. The agency opposite was in flames, and not a soul could be seen. Had the Sioux left? No. At the very moment, more than 200 warriors were hiding behind saw logs and bushes with rifles cocked and aimed, ready to pull the triggers at the signal. Now an Indian appeared among the burning buildings, walking toward the ferry. The soldiers recognized him. White Dog, a sub-chief and frequent visitor at the fort. He motioned them to come across. Marsh hesitated. While he parleyed, a party of Sioux crossed unobserved farther down the river and crept up on his flank. Then White Dog made a gesture. Clouds of smoke sprang up from 100 hidden places. Marsh and his men found themselves suddenly fighting for their lives. Half a dozen soldiers were killed in the first volley, including Quinn, who was pierced by at least a dozen bullets. At the same time, the Indians on the flank opened fire. Marsh tried to charge into the thicket, saw it was useless, and ordered a volley fired instead. His men were falling fast. A retreat was ordered. They threw themselves into the timber near the river and for an hour fought an unequal battle with overwhelming numbers of Sioux, gradually retreating down the stream. At length the captain decided to cross over. To show his men it was feasible, he tried to swim the swift current himself. The eddies caught him, and he drowned. Youthful, gallant, but utterly unfit to cope with Indian warriors. The Sioux harried the rest of the soldiers almost to the fort. Of the 48 who started, exactly half, including the captain, were dead. That was a night of terror at Fort Ridgely. Lieutenant Thomas P. Gare, now commanding, had only a handful of soldiers left and scores of women and children to protect. The women hysterically begged their friends to shoot them rather than let the Indians get them. There were a dozen alarms which set the post frantic with fear. But nothing happened that night. Next morning, refugees still poured in, demoralized with fright. Should Little Crow attack now, nothing could prevent the massacre of every soul in the fort. But for some reason the attack was delayed. The nervous young lieutenant paced the fort with anxious steps. About noon, the challenge from a sentry changed to a shout of joy. Coming down the road from the north at the double quick was a detachment of soldiers. Lieutenant Timothy J. Sheehan was the first reinforcements. 5 hours later, a second detachment came in from the south after an all-night march of 40 miles. There were more than 250 refugees at the fort now. Among them were some resolute men who would make good fighters. Including these settlers, Sheehan, now the senior officer, marshaled about 180 men. Still, the Indians did not attack. Every moment was used in strengthening the defenses. Without warning, on the morning of the 20th, a tall warrior mounted on a splendid horse rode up from the west and demanded a conference. It was Little Crow himself. He wanted to divert the attention from his attack, which was forming on the opposite side. A sudden burst of fire announced the onslaught, and the Sioux leader rode for cover. With wild yells, the Indians stormed the first line of defenses outside the regular limits of the fort. Helter-skelter fled the soldiers for safety, with Sioux tomahawks flashing in their rear. So fierce was the charge that the Redskins actually burst through the second line of defense, a row of log houses which formed the north wall of the fort, and took possession of these barracks. Still, the defense reeled. Working like a man, Sheehan rallied his men on the parade ground. If he did not hold fast here, the fort was doomed. 2 or 3 soldiers fell thrashing on the ground. The undisciplined troops began to waver. Simultaneously, Sioux came out from the buildings and formed for another charge. Sheehan's men began to retreat. Then came aid. Aid, so unexpected it seemed miraculous. Among the few veteran soldiers at the fort was an old artillery sergeant with an unromantic name of Jones. Fort Ridgely had once been an artillery post, and a few old cannon of various patterns and calibers were still parked there. Like all old gunners, Sergeant Jones loved his field pieces. To vary the monotony of garrison life, he had asked and received permission to drill some of the infantrymen in the principle of artillery practice. The soldiers took it up for fun. None of them had any idea that their lives and the lives of others would ever hang upon their skill. At this critical moment of the Sioux attack, Jones bethought himself of his amateur artillerymen and his rusty old cannons. Here and there he hastily collected members of his gun squads and ran to where the ancient field pieces stood. There was some delay in getting things ready. The men were, after all, only infantrymen, and the old sergeant probably had some royal swear words before those 3 guns were loaded. This was finished just as Sheehan's line began to melt before the Sioux fire and the threatened next attack. Now was the time. Everything depended upon the old artilleryman. His wife and children were among the helpless non-combatants crowded in the south buildings of the fort. Aim in their center and fire as rapidly as possible was the order. Just as Sheehan in despair saw his recruits breaking for cover, just as Little Crow's warriors with triumphant yells began their final advance, just as the women in the South Fork gave a concerted cry of terror, the ancient cannon spoke. Across the parade ground hurtled a heterogeneous collection of misfit cannonballs, canister, and solid shot. Working like mad, the sergeant and his men rammed home a second round. Again, the rusty field pieces spoke. It was too much for the Sioux. They could stand rifle fire, and they had done so right bravely. But the wagon guns appalled them. They wavered and began to retreat, and as the third discharge thundered among them, they fled in panic and were followed by the hysterical cheer of the soldiers. Fort Ridgely was saved, and Sergeant Jones was the hero of the day. The Sioux kept the fort surrounded and even attempted another attack the following morning, but the age-worn cannon were now masters of the situation. Before the charge was well started, Sergeant Jones sent several shots among the hostiles and scattered them. Little Crow had been wounded the first day. The sub-chief, Mankata, led the final abortive assault, but the Indians quickly withdrew. The defeat at Fort Ridgely was a blow to the Indians' hope of sweeping the white man out of Minnesota. They had suffered serious losses, and the moral effect had been most discouraging. Sharing the post of the greatest danger with Fort Ridgely was the little German frontier town of New Ulm, a few miles down the river. The morning after the Agency Massacre, a small party of Indians were seen near the town, but were driven off in a brief skirmish. Not much damage was done on either side, but it threw New Ulm, already panic-stricken, into a still greater terror. Judge Charles E. Flandreau of the Supreme Court and ex-sheriff boardman of St. Peter's rode with a company of volunteers to the threatened settlement. The Indians had gone when they arrived, and the next day the town was not molested, for Little Crow was busy with his attack on Fort Ridgely. But the Sioux had by no means forgotten New Ulm. In spite of their defeat at the fort, they moved toward it. Early Saturday, the smoke of burning buildings up the river showed that they were on their way. Judge Flandreau, a man of great force of character, was elected commander of the defending forces. At the approach of the Sioux, he formed his 250 fighting men on the prairie, half a mile west of the town. By 10 o'clock, they were skirmishing with Little Crow's advance guard. Suddenly, a brilliant spectacle unfolded itself. 500 Sioux warriors, in all the color and movement of feathered headdresses, war paint, and brilliant beadwork, rode out of the woods and spread like a giant fan over the prairie. As they reached long rifle shot, they charged. The Sioux, yelling like fiends, looked so horrible that Flandreau's rookies began to retreat. A few more whoops, and in spite of the judge's efforts, the whole line fell back, leaving the outer tiers of houses of the town undefended. The Indians were soon shooting at New Ulm citizens from the shelter of their own homes. Flandreau rode wildly up the hill and succeeded in rallying his men. The crackling of rifle fire became incessant. The white men were hard-pressed, but they held. Then smoke came floating up from the lower end of the town. The Indians had slipped behind the defense and set some buildings ablaze. Now they advanced through the smoke. In a few minutes, the whole lower part of New Ulm was burning. Bullets whined in ever-increasing chorus up the streets. Captain William Dodd, Flandreau's second-in-command, was killed. Captain Saunders was critically wounded with a ball through his body. Under the cover of the smoke, Little Crow massed his warriors in the shelter of some houses near the river. The charge in the morning had been so nearly a complete success that the Sioux believed a second attack would crush the whites. But by now, New Ulm had been under fire for several hours, and the men were steadying down. The Sioux charge came, but a withering fire drove them back. Then, as the Indians withdrew, Flandreau led a fiery countercharge. It caught the Indians by surprise and drove them clear out of the city limits. Evening was falling, and the firing shortly stopped. During the night, Flandreau ordered more than 40 outlying buildings on the outskirts burned to the ground to prevent them from becoming rallying points for the savages on the morrow. A system of trenches was dug, and a large brick house was made into a redoubt, garrisoned and munitioned, but there was no battle on Sunday. The Sioux contented themselves with some long-range shooting. By noon, Little Crow's warriors were in retreat. Fort Ridgely and New Ulm definitely ended any probability that the Sioux would push the settlers out of eastern Minnesota. But Little Crow was not discouraged. The North, and even the South, down into Iowa, where the Inkpaduta had left a trail of blood years before at the Spirit Lake Massacre, offered an unlimited field for his operations. He withdrew his warriors into the wilderness for the present, content for the time to count his scalps and gloat over his booty. They had been repulsed, it is true, but even so, the success of the week's raid exceeded the Indians' most sanguine dreams. At one swoop, the Sioux had won back much of their richest hunting country. Their camps were full of prisoners and plunder. Little Crow was a bigger man than ever among his people. But a new figure was entering the picture. Colonel Henry Sibley, an old soldier in middle life, took command of the Minnesota troops. He had had wide experience, spoke French and the Dakota tongue, and possessed a profound knowledge of the Indian character. Sibley reached the frontier in 3 days, and in 4 more his call for volunteers was answered by 1,400 men. They were raw, undisciplined, and ill-equipped, but they were the only force on which Sibley could lay his hand. With them, he marched toward Fort Ridgely. On the way, he kept his fatigued details busy burying the bodies of the slaughtered settlers. He reached the fort on the afternoon of August 28th, to be received with transports of joy by the people, who, he said, seemed mad with excitement. Next day, he moved towards the lower agency, reaching it in the last of August. His men buried Marsh's soldiers, together with more than 20 dead citizens. Traces of the handiwork of the Sioux were plentiful, but thus far not an Indian had been seen. Major J.R. Brown, with 200 men, moving west along the river, looked for hostiles and buried the dead. They camped at Birch Coulee the night of September 1st. Little Crow was not asleep. His scouts watched, unseen, every movement of the army. Brown's movements was a beautiful opportunity for the Sioux. As dawn broke, there was a war whoop, followed by a sudden volley which swept into camp from the birch woods near at hand. Dead and dying men, kicking and screaming horses, littered the ground. The survivors of that deadly volley threw themselves behind their wagons and fought back. It was a short but terrific little battle. The Sioux poured into the camp, such a storm of bullets that nearly killed every horse, and annihilation threatened the whole command. But Sibley at the agency heard the distant firing and marched immediately to Brown's assistance. The reinforcements reached Birch Coulee in the nick of time. As Sibley's column appeared, the Sioux withdrew up the valley. A picture of bloody wreckage was presented by Brown's camp. It was strewn with the dead and the dying. Some of the wagons were even riddled like sieves. Of Brown's 200 soldiers, 24 were dead, and 67 were wounded, nearly 50%. Sibley retreated to Fort Ridgely to care for the wounded. Birch Coulee wiped out the sting of New Ulm and Fort Ridgely for the Sioux. Sibley, on the other hand, saw that his raw levies were not ready for the job before them, and went into camp to drill them into some sort of coherent military body. It was a big task and took time. Meanwhile, Little Crow ranged far and wide. He led one marauding expedition deep into the northeastern Minnesota, with Hutchinson as its objective. Captain Richard Strout and a company of soldiers met him and were chased for miles, the Sioux almost riding into Cedar Mills on the strength of the wild retreat. But Hutchinson, now a fortified post like every frontier town, was too strong for the Indians. Little Crow, with more scalps and loot, returned to the old reservation camp. While Sibley's army was learning its business, its commander took up the wearisome days in a long-drawn negotiation with Little Crow. Hundreds of prisoners, mostly women and children, were in the hostile camp, and great fear was held for their safety. Sibley, knowing the Indians, feared that these helpless hostages would be murdered wholesale should he march against the Sioux. The wily Red Chief proved more than his match in diplomacy, and Sibley finally gave up the negotiations. Little Crow was making constant raids and keeping all Minnesota in an uproar. Finally, on September 18th, with 1,600 men and 2 pieces of artillery, Sibley marched northwest toward Yellow Medicine River, where the hostile village was reported to be. Little Crow knew this march was in deadly earnest. He felt his handicaps. His warriors were fine natural fighters, but they completely lacked organization. They would not stand up to artillery fire. To maneuver them in battle was practically impossible. On the other hand, they were superior in mobility and were expert in scouting and ambush. In planning the fight with Sibley, the chief kept all of these things in mind. The road to the Sioux village lay through the deep timbered gorge of the Yellow Medicine. Sibley had to pass through it. As he marched past Wood Lake, down into this canyon, a volley of shots rang out half a mile ahead. Indians had fired into a party of foragers. 3 men were down, 1 mortally wounded. Major Welsh's command went at the double quick to the rescue. The foragers were saved, but heavy firing which broke out from the woods ahead showed that they were swarming with Sioux. Little Crow had thrown a cloud of warriors across the road in front. Although the whites did not yet know it, 2 other large bodies of Indians lay hidden in ambush. One along the east side of the road, and the other in a ravine to the right. It was strange for Sibley's men. The woods ahead looked deserted except for the spurts of rifle smoke and the sight of an occasional flitting figure. The constant piping of bullets overhead and the occasional smack as one found its mark made the raw troops nervous. Welsh decided to charge. Into the woods went his men, but the foe they expected to meet had already disappeared. Using the same tactics which were so fatal to Braddock 100 years before, the Sioux slipped away from the direct front and poured in their fire from the flank. Welsh was forced to halt. A staff officer came riding like the wind across the field with an order from Sibley to retire, but the stubborn major did not at once comply. Sibley sent another message to fall back at once. Only then did Welsh order the retreat. Sibley's main body was formed on a low hill. Toward it, Welsh started carrying his wounded. The Sioux leaped in pursuit. There was a moment of hand-to-hand fighting. Then the soldiers began to run. Here was Little Crow's big chance. Had he been able to press home a charge at the backs of the fleeing troops, he might have cut Sibley's line right in 2. But Sibley rushed forward 5 companies under Colonel Marshall, and the Indians were beaten back. Then, too late, after the soldiers were formed and ready, the Sioux attacked in deadly earnest. For 2 hours they tried valorously to take the hill. A headlong charge on the extreme left came very near to carrying home the victory, but Major R.N. McLaren, with 2 companies of recruits, repulsed it. Just then, Indians in the ravine were discovered. Backed by shells from 2 guns, Marshall charged and drove them out. The Sioux had been roughly handled and were losing their zest for the fight. As the day wore on, the fire from the woods slackened. As if at a signal, the Indians disappeared. Sibley, hampered by his wounded, camped where he was. That must have been a gloomy night in the Sioux village. Little Crow recognized the completeness of his defeat in the final stand on the chosen battleground. He could no longer hold his people together. The Sioux broke up their great camp and scattered all over the plains. Sibley said he permitted their escape because he knew that if he pressed too closely, they would slaughter their white captives. Little Crow did try hard to have the prisoners killed after the battle, but the chiefs saw their doom and wanted to soften the punishment. They refused. Little Crow's influence had ended. Days passed. Through friendly Indians, probably the Ojibwa, Sibley got in touch with 3 trustworthy chiefs, offering amnesty and pardon if they would bring the prisoners to him. The offer was accepted. On the afternoon of September 26th, 269 captives were delivered, most of them women and children. All wore Indian clothing. There were some refined and educated women among them. Others were ignorant immigrant settlers, but their consideration for each other was beautiful to see, as they helped the sick and assisted with the young children. Most of them cried with joy and relief, but some merely gave vacant stares. The scenes and experiences through which they had passed had left them dazed and stolid. That night, the rescued captives slept in the tents of the soldiers, and the men taking the hard ground outside. They were sent down to Fort Ridgely the following day, and their relatives, if any were left living, claimed them. The war in Minnesota was over, but there still remained to be written the punishment of its chief figures. Sibley rounded up 1,500 of the Sioux and placed them in prisons at Fort Snelling and Caddo. The rest scattered far and wide over the plains, carrying the seeds of their grievance to other tribes. At the Great Court-Martial, 392 prisoners accused of extreme barbarity were tried. 307 were sentenced to death, and 16 to prison. President Lincoln commuted the death sentences of all but 39, whose cruelties had been too clearly shown. And on December 28th, a great concourse witnessed the execution of these unfortunates on the special gallows built for the purpose. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Little Crow was still at large. Although his followers had deserted him, there were reports that he was gathering new strength and preparing for another invasion. Every day, as fresh rumors were printed in the newspapers, so much fear was attached to his name that it was practically impossible to get the settlers to return to their homes. Nathan Lapson and his son Chauncey were deer hunting in the North Woods on July 3rd of 1863. Stealing through the thickets, they surprised 2 Indians picking berries. Hostiles were scattered all over the country, and no Sioux was a friend. The elder Lapson fired, wounding one of the Indians. The other tried to help him on a horse. As the wounded Sioux attempted to fire at his father, Chauncey Lapson shot him dead. The other Indian mounted and fled. The Lampsons scalped the body and carted it to the neighboring town of Hutchinson. Nobody could identify it. Some claimed they noted a resemblance to Little Crow, but the complexion seemed too light. The mortifying corpse was thrown into an offal pit of a slaughterhouse. Then came an unexpected revelation. A party of Indians was captured on Devil's Lake. Among them was a 16-year-old boy. He said he was a chief, and asking for the commander of the troops by whom he was captured, made a statement of which the following is a part. I am the son of Little Crow. My name is Wawinapsa. I am 16 years old. Father hid after the soldiers beat us last fall. He told me he could not fight against the white men, but would go below and steal horses from them. Then he would go away off. Father wanted me to go with him to carry his bundles. There were no horses. We were hungry. Father and I were picking berries near Scattered Lake. It was near night. He was hit the first time in the side, just above the hip. He was shot the second time, in the side near the shoulder. This was the shot that killed him. He told me he was killed and asked me for water. He died immediately after. Sibley read the statement and at once concluded that the Indian killed by the Lampsons was Little Crow. The corpse was hauled out of its noisome resting place, and there was observed a mark of identification which could not be mistaken. A deformity of his right wrist, caused by a gunshot wound received in the family feud when he was a youth. So died Little Crow at the height of his power, the most feared red man in America, leader of the greatest massacre in American history up to that point, a scholar, a gentleman after his way. He started on the white man's path, but left it when his people's wrongs cried out to him. Reduced to stripping red berries to keep life in his frame, he was at last shot by wandering hunters, and his body thrown into a stinking offal pit of a slaughterhouse.